Imagine just for a moment that everything you have been taught about light is incomplete. Think beyond lamps, stars, or even the sun itself. Imagine light not as a thing you see, but as the very principle that allows seeing, knowing, and being. What if light is consciousness itself? And what if every spiritual tradition at its deepest level has always tried to teach humanity how to remember this truth? This is where our journey begins, with what can only be called the mystic gospel of light, a current of wisdom that flows beneath religions, philosophies, and civilizations, preserved not by institutions, but by those who dared to seek understanding beyond appearances. Imagine that there exists a gospel that was never meant to be confined to paper, doctrine, or authority, a gospel transmitted through symbols, silence, inner revelation, and direct experience. A gospel that does not demand belief, but invites awakening. Think about how radically different this is from what most people call spirituality. Instead of asking you to submit, it asks you to see. Instead of promising salvation in the future, it points to illumination in the present moment. And I promise you something important. The final truth revealed in this journey is the most powerful of all, a revelation so profound that it can permanently change how you understand life, death, and your own consciousness. If this kind of knowledge resonates with you, if you feel that there is more to existence than what is usually explained, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video, and write a comment describing what the word light truly means to you. What you are about to discover is not entertainment alone. It is an invitation to see reality through a deeper lens, one that has transformed seekers for thousands of years. The mystic gospel of light is not a single book, nor a single teaching. It is a pattern of understanding that appears again and again across cultures. In Hermetic philosophy, light is described as the first manifestation of the divine intellect. The Corpus Hermeticum, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and studied extensively by scholars such as Brian Copenhaver, describes creation as an emanation of luminous mind. According to these teachings, darkness is not evil. Darkness is simply the absence of awareness. Light, therefore, is knowledge, and ignorance is the only true bondage. This idea echoes strongly in early Christian mysticism, particularly within Gnostic traditions. Texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, analyzed by scholars like Elaine Pagels and Hans Jonas, reveal a version of Christianity that focused not on guilt or punishment, but on awakening. In these writings, Christ is portrayed as a revealer of light, a guide who awakens dormant consciousness. Salvation is not achieved by external obedience, but by internal realization. The light does not come from heaven, it rises from within the human soul. Consider the implications of this. If the divine light already exists within you, then spiritual growth is not about earning worth, but about removing ignorance. This perspective transforms suffering, fear, and confusion into signals rather than failures. They are shadows cast by unrecognized light. The Gospel of Thomas expresses this with striking clarity when it speaks of the kingdom being both inside and outside the individual. Knowing oneself becomes the doorway to knowing the divine. This theme is not limited to Western traditions. In Eastern philosophies, particularly within Vedanta and Buddhism, enlightenment is described as awakening to an inner luminosity. Consciousness is compared to a lamp that illuminates thoughts, sensations, and the world itself. When ignorance dissolves, light remains. Different languages, different symbols, but the same essential message. Reality is illuminated from within, not imposed from without. Modern thinkers have also touched this ancient truth. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the modern era, described the process of individuation as bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. For Jung, light was not moral superiority but integration. What remains unseen controls us. What is illuminated transforms us. His insights mirror ancient mysticism with remarkable precision, suggesting that the human psyche itself follows the same laws of light and shadow described by spiritual traditions for millennia. Pause for a moment and reflect. If light is awareness, and awareness is what you truly are, then what parts of your life remain in darkness, not because they are evil, but because they have not yet been understood? What truths about yourself might emerge if you allowed honest attention to shine where fear once ruled? These questions are not theoretical. They are deeply personal, and they form the foundation of the mystic gospel of light. Throughout history, this gospel was often misunderstood, hidden, or deliberately obscured, not because it was dangerous in a violent sense, but because it was liberating. A person who understands that light dwells within is far less controllable by fear, guilt, or illusion. This is why such teachings survived through allegory, parable, and secrecy. The light was never extinguished, it was simply protected. What you have heard so far is only the surface. The deeper layers of this gospel reveal why light was associated with logos, wisdom, and divine breath, how it was encoded in sacred symbols, and how it can still be experienced today, not as belief, but as direct knowing. As we continue, the ideas will become more challenging, more transformative, and more intimate. This is only the beginning of the path. Imagine now that this light we are speaking about is not only a metaphor, but a living reality that ancient initiates believed could be directly experienced. Across centuries, those who walked the inner path insisted on one central truth. Light is not something you wait for after death, nor something granted by authority. It is something that awakens when consciousness turns inward. This is where the mystic gospel of light moves from philosophy into direct transformation. In many esoteric traditions, light is described as the substance of the soul itself. The Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus taught that the soul descends into matter and forgets its luminous origin. For him, spiritual practice was not about accumulating rituals, but about turning the soul back toward its source, the One, which he described as absolute light beyond form. This return was not emotional or symbolic. It was experiential, a state of clarity where the division between knower and known dissolves. Plotinus insisted that when this illumination occurs, the individual does not see light, but becomes light. This idea profoundly influenced early Christian mystics, even if later institutions moved away from it. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential theologians of early Christianity, wrote extensively about spiritual illumination. He taught that sacred texts themselves contained layers of light, literal, moral, and spiritual, and that only the awakened mind could perceive the deepest level. For Origen, Christ was not only a redeemer from sin, but the Logos, the divine intelligence that illuminates every human being coming into the world. This was not a distant promise, it was an ever-present reality. Over time, however, this message became increasingly externalized. Light was moved into heaven, postponed until death, and mediated through authority. The mystic gospel of light did not disappear, but it retreated into symbolism. Candles, halos, sacred flames, and luminous visions became substitutes for an inner experience that fewer people were taught how to access. Yet the symbols themselves continued to whisper the truth. Light was still central, still sacred, still associated with awakening. Alchemy offers one of the most profound symbolic expressions of this hidden gospel. Alchemists were not merely attempting to turn lead into gold. According to scholars like Titus Burckhardt and Carl Jung, alchemy was a spiritual language describing inner transformation. The alchemical light, often represented as a subtle fire or inner sun, symbolized consciousness purified from illusion. The great work was not material wealth, but illumination of the soul. When darkness was transformed, light emerged, not by destruction but by understanding. Hermetic texts describe this process as a rebirth in light. The initiate descends into inner darkness, confronts ignorance and fear, and emerges illuminated. This pattern appears again and again from ancient Egyptian initiation rites to later mystery schools. Darkness was never the enemy. It was the womb of light. Without descent, there could be no ascent. Without unknowing, there could be no true knowing. This understanding radically changes how we interpret suffering. Instead of viewing pain as punishment or failure, the mystic gospel of light frames it as friction between awareness and ignorance. When consciousness expands, it illuminates inner contradictions. This can feel uncomfortable, even painful, but it is a sign of awakening, not corruption. The mystics understood this deeply. They spoke of the dark night of the soul not as abandonment by the divine, but as a transition between levels of light. Ask yourself something important here. What if the confusion you have experienced in life was not evidence of being lost, but evidence of being in transition? What if moments of inner darkness were invitations to awaken deeper awareness, rather than reasons to despair. These questions strike at the heart of the gospel we are exploring. Light also plays a central role in how reality itself was understood by ancient thinkers. In many traditions, light was seen as the bridge between the invisible and the visible. It carried form, meaning, and intelligence into matter. The prologue of the Gospel of John echoes this when it speaks of the light that shines in the darkness and is not overcome by it. This was not poetic language alone. It reflected a cosmology where light was the organizing principle of existence. Modern physics, interestingly, has brought light back to the center of reality in a different way. While science and mysticism speak different languages, figures like Albert Einstein acknowledged that light occupies a fundamental role in the structure of the universe. Though physics does not speak of consciousness in mystical terms, the symbolic resonance is undeniable. Light remains central to understanding reality, whether approached from within or without. As this part of our journey comes to a close, one truth should be becoming clear. The mystic gospel of light is not about escape from the world. It is about seeing the world clearly. It is not about rejecting the body, but about illuminating experience. And it is not about blind belief, but about awakened perception. What lies ahead is even more revealing. We will explore why this gospel was feared, how power structures reacted to inner illumination, and how the most profound teaching of all was hidden in plain sight, waiting for those prepared to see it. Consider now why a teaching centered on inner light would provoke fear rather than celebration. A person who discovers illumination within no longer depends entirely on external authority to define truth. This is where the mystic gospel of light quietly collided with systems built on control. Throughout history, institutions thrived on mediation, on positioning themselves as the gatekeepers between humanity and the divine. Inner illumination bypassed that gate entirely. When light is internal, obedience loses its grip. When truth is experiential, fear loses its leverage. This is why many mystical teachings were labeled dangerous, heretical, or subversive, not because they encouraged chaos, but because they encouraged autonomy of consciousness. The light awakened discernment, and discernment threatens systems that rely on unquestioned belief. Gnostic teachers understood this tension deeply. According to the writings examined by Hans Jonas, Gnosticism viewed the material world as obscured by ignorance rather than ruled by evil. Liberation came through awakening, not submission. This message clashed directly with emerging structures of religious authority. Over time, mystical interpretations of light were suppressed, not erased but reinterpreted in safer, more distant forms. Light became symbolic, external, and postponed, yet the message survived in whispers. Mystics like Meister Eckhart spoke of a divine spark in the soul that was identical to the divine itself. Eckhart taught that God is not found through accumulation of concepts, but through inner emptiness that allows light to arise. His sermons emphasized detachment, not as withdrawal from life, but as freedom from illusion. For this, he was accused of heresy. His crime was clarity. The same pattern appears in Sufism, the mystical heart of Islam. Poets like Rumi described light as love, awareness, and presence. The beloved was not distant. The beloved lived within the seeker. Rumi's language was ecstatic, but the message was precise. When the inner light awakens, separation dissolves. The seeker realizes that what was sought was always nearer than breath. Jewish mysticism also preserves this truth. In Kabbalah, light is the substance of creation itself. The concept of divine light flowing through vessels that shattered speaks symbolically of consciousness fragmented by ignorance. The work of the seeker is not to destroy the world, but to gather the scattered sparks through awareness and intention. Once again, illumination is restoration, not escape. Across these traditions, a single pattern emerges. Light is not moral superiority, it is clarity. Darkness is not sin, it is unawareness. This understanding dissolves fear-based spirituality and replaces it with responsibility. When you awaken, you cannot blame ignorance. You must live what you see. This brings us to a critical realization. The mystic gospel of light is not comforting in the conventional sense. It does not promise effortless bliss. It demands honesty. When light enters awareness, it reveals contradictions, illusions, and attachments. This is why awakening is often resisted. Not because it is painful, but because it is uncompromising. Ask yourself something fundamental. If light revealed everything about your inner life without distortion, would you welcome it, or would you prefer the familiar comfort of shadow? This question determines how far one can walk this path. Ancient initiations reflected this truth. Before illumination, the initiate faced symbolic death. This death represented the collapse of false identity. Only then could rebirth in light occur. The light did not add something new. It removed what was never real. This is why mystics across cultures speak of dying before dying. Modern spiritual culture often avoids this dimension. It speaks of light without transformation, illumination without responsibility. But the ancient gospel was clear. To awaken is to change. To see is to act differently. Light reveals truth, and truth demands alignment. As we approach the final stage of this journey, the most powerful teaching of all begins to emerge. It is not about what light is, but about what happens when it is fully realized. This final revelation was hidden not because it was complex, but because it was simple. And simplicity is the most threatening truth of all. There comes a decisive point on the inner path where understanding can no longer remain theoretical. The mystic gospel of light was never intended to be admired from a distance. It was designed to confront, dissolve, and ultimately transform the one who truly encounters it. At this stage, light is no longer discussed as a concept, a symbol, or even a spiritual experience. It is recognized as the very nature of awareness itself. This realization marks the threshold between seeking and knowing. Across the deepest mystical traditions, the final teaching is remarkably consistent and uncompromising. Light is not something the soul acquires. It is what the soul is when illusion falls away. This is why ancient texts speak not of accumulation, but of removal. Ignorance is stripped, false identity collapses, and what remains is clarity. The seeker does not rise toward light. The seeker awakens as light. This realization carries profound consequences. When awareness recognizes itself as luminous, the division between observer and observed dissolves. Life is no longer experienced as something happening to a separate individual, but as a unified field of perception. This is what mystics meant when they spoke of unity, not as an abstract belief, but as a lived state of consciousness. At this level, truth is not interpreted. It is seen. The Upanishads describe consciousness as self-luminous, needing nothing outside itself to be known. Christian mystics echoed this insight when they spoke of the divine image within the soul. Meister Eckhart taught that there is something in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable, identical to the divine source itself. Hermetic texts describe the awakened human as a being who knows themselves as both mortal and immortal, both within time and beyond it. These are not metaphors meant to inspire comfort. They are precise descriptions of a radical shift in perception. When this shift occurs, spirituality is no longer separate from daily life. There is no longer a division between sacred moments and ordinary moments. Every interaction becomes transparent. Every choice carries weight. This is why illumination is often described as a burden as much as a liberation. Light removes excuses. It dissolves unconscious patterns. It reveals where fear hides behind belief and where habit replaces truth. This is also why the mystic gospel of light was never designed for passive consumption. It demands responsibility. Once you see clearly, you cannot return to unconscious living without inner conflict. This is the cost of awakening, not suffering imposed from outside, but the inability to lie to oneself. The illuminated mind cannot pretend ignorance. It must align action with understanding. Contrary to popular spiritual fantasies, awakening does not detach a person from humanity. It binds them more deeply to it. When awareness recognizes itself in all beings, compassion arises naturally, not as a moral obligation, but as recognition. The suffering of others is no longer abstract. It is intimate. This is why authentic mystics radiated humility rather than superiority. There was no identity left to defend. At this level, the final teaching of the mystic gospel of light reveals itself with stark simplicity. The kingdom of light was never a distant realm, a future reward, or a place reserved for the chosen. It is a state of awakened awareness available here and now, but it cannot be inherited, borrowed, or believed into existence. It must be realized. This realization does not promise constant bliss. It offers clarity. It does not eliminate pain. It removes unnecessary suffering. It does not grant control over life. It dissolves the illusion that control was ever possible. What remains is presence, discernment, and an unshakable intimacy with reality as it is. The final silence of the mystics was not emptiness, it was fullness beyond words. This is why the deepest teachings were transmitted indirectly, through paradox, symbol, and negation. Language collapses at the threshold of direct seeing. What remains cannot be explained. It can only be lived. So the mystic gospel of light does not truly end here. It withdraws. It steps aside. What follows is no longer narration, doctrine, or teaching, but direct responsibility. To see clearly is to live truthfully. To awaken is to embody what has been revealed. The light was never hidden from you. It was hidden as you. Thanks for looking.